My name is Ebony McCorvey. I am from Region 10 ESC. All right, so for this morning, we are going to talk about creditable foods. This is going to be what UCEs need to know in order to serve a meal that will be for reimbursement. But first, I want to know, what do you know about creditable foods and CACFP? I know y'all are probably experienced CACFP CEs. You've been doing this since the 90s or early 2000s, and you have been around the road with CACFP more than once. And so I want to know right now in the chat if you can say how many years of experience you have in CACFP, as well as what is a creditable food? Just in your own definition. Doesn't have to be an official TDA definition, your definition. What is a creditable food in CACFP? Go. All right. In the chat right now, I want you all to put in your years of experience with CACFP, as well as what is creditable foods. The timer is going. When the timer is out, then we'll come back together and we'll move on to the first slide. Go ahead and tell me right now, what is it that you know? All right, how we do? Moderators, I want y'all to look and see in the chat, see what we need to talk about. Who got it right? All right. Moving on. All right, so the first we're going to talk about are parts of the meal pattern. The first that we're going to talk about in meal pattern that applies for children and adult meal patterns alike are the information that's included in each part of the meal pattern. So the first is meal types. We have on the upper left-hand side, we have meal types. For example, breakfast is a meal type. You can serve meals in the morning, just like you would at home, and be a breakfast meal type. But there's many meal types throughout the day that you can serve in your CACFP and in a variety of combinations. Some programs have a snack in the morning, and some have a snack in the afternoon instead. But real quickly in chat, if your name begins with the letter L, I want you to enter into the chat other types of meal service served in the CACFP. I've already mentioned snacks, but what other types of meal service are there? Really quickly, if your name starts with the letter L. All right, next, we need to know the age group that we are serving. After we figure out what our meal type is, we gotta know, who are we serving? Are we serving children? Are we serving adults, senior? We all can think of a couple of reasons why knowing the age group that you are serving is important when you're planning your meal and you're thinking of creditable foods. What could be completely appropriate for an adult to eat might not be appropriate for a certain child of a certain age. And so right now in chat, let's do another game. If your last name begins with the letter M, in the chat, I want you to say, what age groups do you serve in your CACFP? All right, thank you everyone for answering. So after we have determined our meal type that we're going to serve, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or a snack, and then we are certain of the age group that we want to serve, that we have the right meal pattern, the next thing that we're going to determine from the meal pattern is the food component. It'll tell you in what pattern, in what way to serve your meals in your CACFP. So question, does every meal type require the same components? Use the yes or no option on your participant toolbar to give me the answer. All right. Thank you, everyone, for answering. So we know now that not every meal type requires the same components, right? The next we're going to talk about are the amounts. The meal pattern is going to give you the amount, the quantity, however you like to term it, of the food component that you need. So it's going to tell you whether you need a half a cup portion for a certain age group of vegetables versus a 1/4 cup for the same type of vegetable, depending on their age. So your meal pattern comes out kind of like a template. You get your nice template of what you're supposed to serve, but the food buying guide and the crediting handbook provides such a wealth of additional information that you're not able to get in just your template format of the meal pattern to know what you need to serve for a meal service. Utilize those resources. They're really helpful. So on the surface, following the meal pattern looks to be pretty easy because you just have these easy pieces to put together, but there is a lot of information that is included within these different sections. And remember that anything that is incomplete or missing from a menu and ultimately your meal production record, let's say it is your minimum quantities, that is a serious thing that if you do not attend to your mistakes on meal production records or in your menu planning, it could lead to meals that are not reimbursed. Speaking of reimbursable meals, next let's talk about what's in the reimbursable meals. First, we have the right food. Right food means that it is a creditable food items, a food that counts toward the credit of that specific component for the meal pattern or the meal required. Next, it is the right amount. Served in the right amount, at least in the minimum amount listed in the meal pattern. That is what this means. And last but not least, at the right time. The USDA and TDA have requirements that you have to serve meals inside of. Well, not to discuss waivers going on with the coronavirus currently, but in general, there are time restrictions in which you can serve meals in the CACFP. Follow along with handbooks to get your most updated guidelines. And there are other benefits to planning your meals in advance. For seasoned veteran sponsors and CEs, what are some other advantages of pre-planning, advanced planning of your meals? Things that are logical to your program, not necessarily anything to do with Creditable Meals. What are some of those advantages to planning your meals out before? Thank you, everyone who gave answers. Things like reducing your food costs, creating healthier meals by being able to take a step back and look in your menus, reducing your preparation time, and creating a greater variety of what you can offer to your students are just some of the advantages for planning ahead. When you take a step back from your menu and you do a review, not when you're in meal service, you're allowed to see things that you might not have saw otherwise, or things that you might have forgotten that are critical and important. Something like serving water to your participants throughout the day. That is a requirement of the CACFP. Maybe you need to put it on your actual menu or schedule so that you and your staff do not forget to have this available to your children, among the many things that you have to remember. The first meal component that I want to discuss is milk. The CACFP meal pattern has 5 components. The milk component. Serve whole unflavored milk to 1-year-olds. Serve only unflavored milk to children 1 through 5 years old. Fluid milk served to participants ages 2 and older must be fat-free or skim or low-fat 1% milk. When serving flavored milk to children 6 years old and older and to adults, only serve the fat-free variety. It is important to note that the DFPS, Department of Family Protective Services, child care licensing does not allow flavored or sweetened milk to be served other than on special occasions. A nutritionally equivalent non-dairy substitute may be served as part of reimbursable meal to participants who submit in writing. Next section is for adults only. A serving of milk is not required as supper meals for adults. 6 ounces in weight or 3/4 cup in volume of yogurt may be used to meet the equivalent of 8 ounces of fluid milk once per day, when yogurt is not served as a meat alternate in the same meal. Example of milk include, hey, how about y'all give us some examples instead? Thank you everyone who answered in the chat. The next component that we are going to discuss are meat and meat alternatives. This component includes beef, chicken, fish, pork, beans, nuts, eggs, cheese, and yogurt. A complete listing of creditable items can be found in the food buying guide. Yogurt must contain no more than 23 grams of total sugar per 6 ounces. Meat and meat alternates may be served in place of the entire grain requirement at breakfast, a maximum of 3 times per week. Tofu and soy yogurt products are allowed to be used as meat. Non-commercial tofu and soy yogurt products are not creditable. Non-commercial meaning made at home. You know, alternatives to meat have become more popular in today's culture, even among young consumers that might be in your daycare operation or at risk after school. What are some meat or meat alternatives that you use in your CACFP? Great. Thank you everyone who submitted answers. Next, we're going to discuss grains. For a grain item to be creditable towards a reimbursable meal, a serving must contain no less than 14.75 grams of enriched or whole grain meal or flour, bran, or germ. CEs should use Exhibit A from the food buying guide to determine the proper serving size for a particular type of item. Starting back in October 1st, 2019, ounce equivalents are used to determine the amounts of creditable grains. At least 1 grain per serving per day across all eating occasions must be a whole grain rich item. CEs should use Exhibit A from the food buying guide to determine the proper serving size for a particular type of item. Grain-based desserts can no longer be served for the grain component. Grain-based desserts are defined as those used in USDA's food buying guide for child nutrition programs. Exhibit A, which is denoted as desserts with subscripts 3 and 4. Let's recap really quickly. So, if you are a child care and you only serve 1 meal a day and it is a snack meal, do you have to serve a whole grain rich item? If you said yes in your head, then you are correct. If you only have 1 eating occasion to serve, you must serve the whole grain rich item. Remember, you must serve at least 1 whole grain rich item over all of the eating occasions that you serve. So if you only serve 1 meal, you must serve your whole grain rich item within that meal. But then on the opposite side, let's say you're a child care and you serve breakfast and lunch and a PM snack. You get to choose when you want to serve your whole grain rich item. Make a choice between all of those eating occasions on which you want to serve your whole grain rich items. If you want to every Monday serve your whole grain rich item during your snack meal, and every Tuesday through Friday serve your whole grain rich items through lunch, you could do that. That is your option, and you may switch as you need to. Okay, now let's talk about whole grain rich items. What does the whole grain rich part mean, right? Whole grain rich means that at least 50% of the grains in your grain item that you're planning to serve are made up of whole grains. Or it could be up to 100%. You might have a 100% whole grain item. It might be just 50% whole grain, but either one, 50% to 100% whole grain rich ingredients, you are allowed to serve that as your whole grain rich item. Now you might say, Ebony, I still don't know what you're talking about. How do I determine if a product is whole grain rich or not? So let's look at an example together. So this is a random ingredient label for some crackers. And if we look at this label here on the screen, we have whole wheat flour as the first ingredient. So what it means whenever there is an ingredient in any label that is the first ingredient, that means by volume, that is the highest amount in volume of that ingredient, of that particular ingredient. So the whole wheat flour is the main ingredient in this particular cracker, and the enriched flour is the next grain that is mentioned. Whenever you're looking for a whole grain rich item, you are going to look to see what are the primary ingredients. This one, by the rule of just the very primary, the very first ingredient being a whole wheat flour, then this will qualify as a whole grain rich item. When you have a mix of grains in a particular food, something like maybe a pizza crust, then you might have a mixture of flours that are in that particular item. So you have to know by volume or by weight how much is a part of each grain to know if it is a whole grain rich. If you have by volume more white flour than you do whole wheat flour by weight, then the white flour outweighs the whole wheat flour, right? So if your weight of the white flour outweighs, then it will not be a whole grain rich item. So you have to look at each individual label. Try not to fall into the habit of looking at just the health claims that are on food packaging, because the health claims that say it's made with whole grain flour, or it provides a certain amount of grains per serving, doesn't necessarily mean that this will be a whole grain rich item that is credible for this program. So please look at each label that you have when you're trying to figure out what is going to be your whole grain rich item for the day. The last thing that I want to discuss are cereals. Ready to eat cereals or breakfast cereals have sugar limits. You cannot have any more than 6 grams per dry ounce of cereal for the grain component in the CACFP. There were sugar requirements that were added in 2019 that you must adhere to as well. Look at your WIC approved list of breakfast cereals to get a determination on some cereals that you could serve in your CACFP. All right, next we're going to talk about vegetables. According to the Food Buying Guide, there is a list of creditable food components related to vegetables. Vegetable is its own separate food component for lunch and supper and at snack. Vegetable and fruit components are combined at breakfast. Pasteurized full-strength juice may only be used to meet the vegetable or fruit requirement at one meal, including snack, per day. An eighth a cup, or really about 2 tablespoons, is the minimum credible amount for the vegetable and fruit component. Next is fruit component. Fruits is now a separate component at lunch and supper and a snack. Vegetable and fruit components are combined at breakfast. Pasteurized full-strength juice may only be used to meet the vegetable or fruit requirement at one meal, including snack, per day. An eighth of a cup, or 2 tablespoons, is a minimum credible amount for the vegetable and fruit component. Next, we will discuss the infant meal pattern. There are 2 age groups, 0 to 5 months and 6 to 11 months, for the infant meal pattern. Solid foods are allowed when the child is developmentally ready for them. Gradually introduce solid foods with the permission of the family. Breastfeeding and infant snacks are allowed as the child is developmentally ready. Meals may be reimbursed when the mother breastfeeds on site. The mother may also send breast milk to serve with the meal or with other solid food items for the child. A vegetable or fruit must be served as snack for older infants. No juices for infants. Not full strength juice, no juices. Ready-to-eat cereals are allowed as a snack for older infants as developmentally ready. Meat and meat alternates allows cheese, cottage cheese, and yogurt. It also allows whole eggs. Not allowed are cheese food or cheese spreads as of October 1st, 2017. Yogurt must contain no more than 23 grams of total sugars per 6 ounces. Breakfast cereals, like with children in the CACFP meal pattern, it must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. Infant formula and infant dry cereal must be iron fortified. Beginning in October 1st, 2019, 1 ounce equivalents are used to determine the quantity of the creditable grain. A serving of this component is required when the infant is developmentally ready to accept it. For sponsors that are claiming infants for reimbursable meals, you must offer at least one brand of iron fortified infant cereal to the families, but they are welcome to select their own brand that is creditable for reimbursement. If what the parent provide is not iron fortified, then it is not creditable, and you will not be allowed reimbursement for that. If a licensed physician determines that an infant needs formula or food that do not follow the infant meal pattern, a medical statement must be on file and a substitute food must be listed on the statement. The caregiver may then claim the meals for reimbursement. Parent or guardian decides when the child is developmentally ready to accept solid and complementary foods. And remember, it is recommended that breast milk be served in place of formula from birth to 11 months. But formula is accepted. For more information, please take a Creditable Infant Foods class. This is the child meal pattern next. This is the breakfast meal pattern for children. There are 4 age groups for the child meal pattern. You have the 1 to 2-year-olds, 3 to 5-year-olds, 6 to 12-year-olds, and 13 to 18-year-olds. You will notice that for each age group, there are different amounts. So you must note that you must serve the minimum quantities of each food components for the separate age groups. You see for breakfast, you do have your milk, vegetable or fruit component, and a grain. You may serve a meat alternate in substitution for the grain up to 3 times per week. Something else to note is that footnotes are usually at the bottom of meal patterns when you're looking at them on squaremeals.org, as we saw in the infant meal pattern previously. This one has them as well for the child meal pattern, but they are not seen on this screen. Whenever you have an older age group as well, you may serve a larger portion than what is the minimum on the requirement. You may do so to meet the nutritional requirements of your students. And remember that water should be served throughout the day as required by the Texas Department of Family Protective Services and by TDA. Now that we've all discussed the infant and the child meal pattern, let's look at some examples together live.